celebration of a civil rights milestone, President Barack Obama tonight helps the NAACP celebrate its 100th anniversary. But Mr. Obama may face some tough questions on what it is that he's doing to help the African American community, particularly given the recession. Now, many African Americans face unemployment rates nearly 5% higher than the national average. Joining me right now to break this all down, what he can say, what is happening, Michael Steele. He is the chairman of the Republican National Committee. Marshawn Evans, the founder of the corporate consulting firm ME Unlimited, and Fox Business contributor and WStreet.com founder, Mr. Charles Payne. What an all-star lineup. I'm so excited to see the three of you. All right. There's a lot to talk about. Michael, let me start with you. These have been very trying times, a very challenging recession, particularly for African Americans. In fact, if you look at those unemployment rates that we're talking about, the rate of unemployment is growing for African Americans at a far faster pace than white Americans. Why is that happening, and what can this president do about it?
Well, there are systemic issues that have plagued the black community going back to the Great Society days. And so you're talking 40-plus years of policies that have almost entrenched this gap, if you will, between black unemployment, white unemployment, you know, the jobless rate, the poor education rates, et cetera. And I think that there are, again, systemic issues that have not been addressed, and it's a real concern that's beginning to bubble up, if you will, among some African American thinkers who are looking at the public policy and looking at those issues that can more directly address, you know, the poor performance in jobs, the poor performance in education, et cetera. I think the president has to answer those questions at some point. He hasn't to date. In the two press conferences where he's been asked by African American reporters, how will his policies specifically help and address these systemic issues in his community, his answers have been very generic. They've been very much tied to, well, as I help white America, I help black America.
Yes.
And that's not necessarily what African Americans are looking to hear right now.
You know, Charles, there have been a lot of articles written here in the New York area for people who don't know what has happened in New York City alone to African American men. In the first quarter of 2008, unemployment rate was at 5.7%. Charles, last statistic I saw, first quarter 2009, 14.7%. This is known as the melting pot.
Right.
What's happening?
Well, Michael made a whole lot of good points. You know, going back to when I was growing up in the 70s, you had one period where unemployment for young black people was 50%. It's a two-pronged thing, Alexis. It's partly the jobs that a lot of black people have in New York City particularly, like men in general, because men are losing jobs across the board at a more rapid rate than women. You know, the construction jobs have faded, and you know, a lot of the jobs that you do with your hands have faded, and that speaks to what has to be done within the black community. You got a two-pronged problem here. You do have, it's a conundrum. Racism is still a huge problem. I mean, anyone who doesn't think it is because we have a black president or Oprah is worth $1 billion is out of their minds. Particularly as someone gets into a corporation and moves up the ladder, it's a huge problem. But what probably is a bigger problem right now is blacks are going to have to be a lot more accountable, look in the mirror and say, we need a new game plan. And that's what I hope we get from the NAACP, because we can't focus on the victimization as much as how do we get around this. And a lot of it is being honest. And Michael touched on that. We have to get our education, you know, work on the educational thing. The dropout rates in cities, urban cities, are skyrocketing, skyrocketing. And that's why the future even looks bleak, even as we do have a black president.
You know, it's interesting, Marshawn, one of the points that Charles makes is empowering yourself. And one of the areas about empowerment is about preparing for your financial future and having a nest egg and being prepared for these types of situations, which many people across this country were not prepared for. One of those big issues, though, is retirement. I mean, what does the community need to do? What does the NAACP need to say to the members of this organization?
Well, I think that one of the things President Obama is going to focus on this year when he speaks to the NAACP will be very similar to what he focused on last year, and that is the role that government and business has in addressing the issues of poverty and violence and breaking that cycle. But even more so, the second thing he focused on last year was personal responsibility, and there needs to be a greater focus on long-term savings and understanding how economics work in this country. That's not something that's heavily focused on in communities of color. And financial literacy is extremely important, and I hope that the NAACP takes a greater focus on economic justice in teaching people how to make better financial decisions, teaching them how to understand the loans and the paperwork that they're signing so that they don't find themselves in the situation that we're in right now.
Charles Payne, you are a small business owner, and I'm sorry, Marshawn, Charles was shaking his head when you first started talking about government, the role of government and all of this.
Yeah, I mean, again, if we start to blame all of our problems on them, the government, big business, they're shutting you out, they're mean-spirited, they're hurting you, that's ridiculous. Also, the notion that someone who doesn't even know how they're going to pay their rent is going to know how to save. Now, that is a huge problem. We see it with athletes all the time. How the heck can Mike Tyson be broke after making $400 million? So there's no doubt that we have to work on that.
Oh, Michael,
There's
go ahead.
no doubt that we have to work on that, but
Michael, you're laughing. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I think Charles is exactly right. I mean, again, the government is not the solution for the ills. In fact, for solving the ills, they are part of the problem. When you create this, I mean, I saw it in my own neighborhood growing up, this dependency on that check every month. The reality of it is you can talk about financial literacy all day long, but if you are not graduating students, black students, through our system, if you're not educating them, if you're not empowering them to be able to go into the market, to get the job that will allow them to access that opportunity, that's where it all fails. This fall, if you have 10 African American students who are starting kindergarten, only one of them will graduate from high school. 75% dropout rate for African American males. Well, government is not the way to change it.
There's a way that we can change it, and government is a part of the solution, and that's the biggest difference that we have here. Government. Well, whatever part it should be, it needs to be a more proactive part. And the problem that we've had is that there has been this derogation of government involvement in a responsible manner. Young people in the inner cities in urban America do not have the same access to quality education as young people in the suburbs. And what that does is it produces a cycle of inefficiency,
an excuse.
That's
what it does. Marshawn, I got to interrupt.
It produces a cycle, and it has to be addressed. Go ahead, Charles. It has to be addressed.
This is what bothers me.
If you don't focus on it, America is not going to be prepared to compete in a global economic market.
You're saying that black people can never be successful in this country unless ultimately the white man or the government pulls them out of poverty. They have the ability to pull themselves out. Okay, if the schools are subpar, so be it. Pick up the book and read it anyway. You can't drop out.
I don't disagree
you can't
with
keep
that.
blaming everybody.
I'm not blaming anybody. The two of you are blaming other people. What I'm saying, you need to focus on personal responsibility first and foremost. It is the job of the African American community to educate African Americans. It is the job of us to take more responsibility for our communities. But there has to be, in order to bake a cake, you have to have the ingredients to work with in the first place. So we have to have better teachers, we have to have better resources, and we have to give these young people an opportunity to succeed in the first place so that they can be competitive in the job market, and that they can have...
Let me just interject just one last point here, Michael. I want to give you the last word. A lot of people believe this president became the president of the United States because of a race-based speech that he gave several months before the election. Some believe because he is African American, he's being very, very careful about what role he is willing to play in revitalizing the African American community. Is that putting him in a precarious situation, or is it not? Does he need to do more?
I think there is some truth to that. I think there's a sensitivity, if you will, by a lot of the people around the president, maybe even the president himself, that he doesn't come off as, favoring the black community because he's black. But I'm sorry, you cannot, and Charles has already touched on this, you cannot step away from the fact that right now the recidivism rate, the dropout rate, the AIDS infection rate, the jobless rate, the poverty rate in the African American community requires more than just lip service concern. These inner cities are decaying because of policies that basically say the government will take care of it. And I think when you're talking about defunding scholarship opportunities here in the District of Columbia for 1,700 African American kids who otherwise would be stuck in a failing public school, that is the root of the problem.
Okay. All right. I would like to see
if the government has a role in that solution as well.
Okay.
Well, the government is the one that's defunding the money. That's the point. The administration defunded the scholarships for those students.
Fantastic conversation. I'd love to see if the three of you can join us tomorrow morning after you watch the president.